Hello, everyone. My name is Sharnice Peters, and I am the Program Analyst of the Office of Community Services, Division of Energy Assistance. On behalf of OCS, I would like to welcome you to today's webinar, providing a 60-minute training for the fiscal year 2020 Performance Data Forum, focusing on an overview and reminders for Module 1, the Grantee Survey module. Today's webinar will be presented by Melissa Torgerson of Verb Associates and Dan Bausch from McCry. Today's webinar has 4 purposes. First, the webinar will provide a brief overview of Module 1 and what grantees are required to report. Second, it will furnish details on new requirements relating to the LIHEAP CARES Act funds. Third, the webinar will explain key concepts for completing the report. Finally, the webinar will review some general reminders. Today's webinar is the first of 2 webinars on the Grantee Survey. The audience for today's webinar is LIHEAP State and Territory Coordinators and other staff who have completed the Grantee Survey in the past. The next webinar will focus on a more detailed review for newer staff or those who want a line-by-line review. We appreciate your time today and for joining us. We hope this is helpful as you prepare to complete your report. With that, I'll turn this over to Melissa.
Hello, we're so happy you're able to join us today. Today is a 60-minute webinar, and the slides are already available for download under the handouts section of the GoToWebinar sidebar. This webinar is being recorded and will be published on the ACF YouTube channel. If you have a question as we go along, you're encouraged to submit them, as we're moving through the slides versus waiting until the end. Go ahead and type them into the GoToWebinar Question Box, and there's a diagram here showing you where that is. Submitted questions will be reviewed and responded to at the end of the webinar, and if for some reason there is no time or it's a very specific question related to you as a grantee, then we will email you shortly after the webinar. This is a presentation outline. These webinars can be a little bit dense, and some of you like to go back and review them after the presentation. And so this gives you kind of an index or a table of contents of the slides so that when you go back to look for key questions or topics, you can find them easily. We're going to start with an overview of the Grantee Survey. As many of you know, the performance data form is one report, and it consists of 3 models. Module 1 is a grantee survey, which we're going to talk about today. Module 2 and 3 are performance measures, which we held webinars on recently, and so you can go and look those webinars up if you want to learn more or give us a call. But today we're going to focus on Module 1, which is the grantee survey. This is a report for those of you who have been in LIHEAP a long time. You've been doing this report a long time. And what it does is it provides OCS with information about how you all obligate your funds during a specific federal year. So the 3 main types of data that you'll be reporting are the amount of funds obligated to different LIHEAP components, the average LIHEAP benefit provided to households for each of those components, and the income eligibility criteria used for each LIHEAP program component. It's important that you understand that this is not an audit report. It's not the equivalent of your federal financial report, for example. This really just gives OCS and the public a good idea of how your funds are parsed out among different program elements each year, and the average benefits people are receiving, and how you are setting up your eligibility criteria. This is an example of the data once we get it from you. As you all know, the LIHEAP data warehouse takes all of the data from your reports and puts them into these pretty graphs. And this is one of them. This is how we would take your grantee survey data and use it so that a person in the public or Congress or OCS or another grantee or you can go in and look pretty quickly at a snapshot of how you have obligated the funds that you received in fiscal year 2019 or for this report 2020. This is a really important graphic. It took me a long time to kind of really figure this out, but all of these reports do fit together. The model plan is basically saying ahead of time, this is what we plan to do with our money, who we plan to help, what we plan to accomplish with our funding. The household report then comes after the year is over, and you say, okay, well, we said this is what we're going to do in our model plan. Here's how we helped people and who we helped. So this follows the people, the household report. It looks at who you served and how many you served and their characteristics. The grantee survey follows the money. So the household report follows the people. The grantee survey says, here's how all those dollars we got were spent. We did what we said we were going to do, or we didn't do what we planned on doing. So this is where those dollars went. This is how we distributed them among households, and this is the eligibility of the households that receive those dollars. And then performance measures, of course, talk about the impact of all of it. So you know, we put our money here, we served these people, and these were the changes that we saw as a result of those decisions. And so we're going to look at Grantee Survey Update with Dan.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Jorge, if you want to go to the next slide. We wanted to give you all an update on the status of the FY20 performance data form. OCS has been working very hard to try to be able to issue a communication about the form. They are working on it now, and we are expecting them to issue the action transmittal soon. If you've been on the recent performance measures webinars, we've indicated through those webinars that the new due date for the performance data form is going to be in March. The action transmittal, when it's published, will include the instructions, but right now you have access to last year's instructions on the action transmittal page of the ACF LIHEAP website. So we encourage you, if you're working and you have a specific item you need to look at, to go and consult those until the new action transmittal is issued. Because the due date will be in March, we strongly encourage you to prepare your FY20 reports now and to be working on them. This is a great slide to share if you need to share it with others in your department to be able to have staff to help you work on it. It's going to be unlike the past, where the action transmittal might come out in the end of the year, and then the report's due in January or February. The action transmittal will be coming out soon, and it will be due in March. So it's best to be starting now so you're prepared to submit your report. There are new changes for the FY20 grantee survey, and we're going to review those in this webinar, and then in the next webinar, the more detailed one that you'll get an email about registering for. If you would like a more detailed review of them, you can also sign up for that webinar or share it with your staff. So there's two main types of changes that are occurring this year related to the grantee survey and the performance data form. The first is, for the grantee survey, there are new CARES reporting requirements that have been added to the form. The second is that there's going to be a different approach for submitting the report this year, and I'm going to talk about both of these. Okay, so the first change is new LIHEAP CARES reporting requirements. As you all know, the CARES Act was passed by Congress and signed by the President last year, and on May 8th, OCS released LIHEAP CARES Act funds to grantees. At that time, a Dear Colleague letter was issued that announced the funds and that mentioned that grantees would need to track, account for, and report on those funds and how they're used. So for OCS to be able to monitor the use of the CARES Act funds and to report that information to Congress and the public, the grantee survey for 2020 and for next year's 2021 report will have new separate CARES lines asking you to report on your uses and sources and uses of CARES funds. So what does this mean? This means that you'll need to report pieces of information for your regular LIHEAP funds, non-CARES funds, and you'll need to report the same information in relation to your CARES funds and programs. So that includes the total amount of funds you received and the total amount of funds you used for different assistance types, the average benefits you provided with your regular LIHEAP funds, and the average benefits you provided with your CARES funds, and the maximum income levels or thresholds that you used for those program components. So that's a summary of the first change, and we're going to go into more detail a little bit later in the webinar. The second change is the submission approach. So OCS is in the process of working to have the new CARES lines for the Grantee Survey added into OLDC. However, that process is ongoing. And so to assist you with being able to complete your report and have a timely submission, OCS is planning to send each grantee an Excel spreadsheet version of the performance data form. And that spreadsheet would include the pre-populated information on the sources of funds you received. They're then going to ask you to enter your information into that spreadsheet and to submit the spreadsheet by the March due date. As in the past and as recently for your household report, your submitted information would be reviewed. If there's any questions or if there's any items that might be a potential issue, we'd reach out to you about that. And we'd alert you when your report is considered final. And then once the programming is complete in OLDC, OCS Enterprise would ask you to copy the information from the spreadsheet into OLDC. So this is different than what you've done for the household report. It's different than what you've done for recent reports. But it's something that has occurred in the past related to submitting information in spreadsheets, and it's something that the goal is to make it as easy and simple as possible for you to be able to do this and to have fields filled in for you on sources of funds. So I'll go over that a little bit more later as well. But next we want to focus in on some of the key concepts for reporting. So we're thinking about the Grantee Survey and what are the important concepts to keep in mind when reporting on your program during FY20.
So the first key concept is about the reporting period. The FY 2020 Grantee Survey is focused on federal fiscal year 2020, and that's from October 1, 2019 to September 30, 2020. You may have applicants that applied in 2019 but received their benefit during 2020. These should be included when you're calculating your average benefits amount for this report. If you operate any of your programs on a different calendar, for example, January to December or July to June, the data used to complete the survey still needs to correspond to the federal fiscal year period, which means you might have to pull information for portions of 2 of your program years. So this is just a little bit of detail here. For sources of funds, which is a big piece of this report, you're going to include all funds awarded by OCS in FY 2020 and funds optionally carried into FY 2020 from 2019. For uses of funds, you're going to report on how the 2020 sources of funds were obligated or not obligated during FY 2020. For income eligibility thresholds, you're going to report on your income cutoff level set at the start of each program component in 2020. And average benefits, you're going to report on the mean or the average benefit amount for the households that received their benefit during FY 2020. The second key concept, and this is a really important one, is the idea of uses of funds, which is about obligations. So the Grantee Survey asks you to report total funds for different program components, and it refers to the amount of your available funds that you obligated to each program component. Now, many of you have talked about this before. The statute provides you with a great deal of flexibility in defining what constitutes an obligation, and this varies across grantees. So for some of you, this includes the official designation of funds for specific purposes, so encumbered funds. If you've put aside money for a contract, for example, in some states that's considered obligated. In many states, the issuance or commitment of funds to subgrantees or partners for specific purposes is also considered an obligation. Whether they spend it or you spend it or not, it's been committed in a particular way. This means that obligations are not always the same as expenditures. Expenditures include benefits that are issued or paid. In some cases, obligated funds may not actually be expended until after the end of the fiscal year. For example, a grantee might obligate funds for heating assistance during the fiscal year, but a portion of those funds might not actually be expended as benefits until subsequent fiscal years. So this report is all about obligation. Where have you committed the money based on your state definition of what obligation means? A third key concept for reporting are carryover funds. Carryover funds are funds that you did not obligate during the same fiscal year because you elected to carry over or hold available those funds for obligation in the next year. Regular LIHEAP and LIHEAP CARES funds can be carried over from 2020 to 21, but the allowable limits differ for each funding source. For your regular funds, you can carry over 10% of the funding as unobligated. However, for LIHEAP CARES, you can carry the full 100% over as unobligated. For the Grantee Survey, the amount you report as being carried over to FY21 should match the amounts in your final FY 2020 carryover and reallotment report. I can't understate this enough. This means you may need to go back in and update your carryover and reallotment report so that the numbers match what you're reporting as carryover in your Grantee Survey. If you need assistance submitting a revision to your carryover and reallotment report, please contact us and we'll be happy to help you. And now we're going to go into the new CARES reporting requirements.
Okay, so now we've gone over some of the key concepts so we can dive in to these new reporting requirements. As I mentioned earlier, the Grantee Survey has been expanded to have new fields related to the CARES Act funds. The form layout, the good news is the form layout remains the same. It looks very similar to what you've seen in the past. It's not completely different. The form has the same structure, but there have been new CARES lines added, and I'm going to show you those soon. And you'll need to report information first for your regular LIHEAP funds, your non-CARES funds, and then report the same information for your CARES funds only. Okay, so one important item with thinking about how the Grantee Survey has been changed for CARES reporting is to remind you of the changes for the household report and show you how the Grantee Survey is a little bit different. So for the household report that you've all just worked on, the report was updated so that you would report first on all households that received a type of assistance. For example, all households that got heating assistance, whether they got a benefit paid with their regular LIHEAP funds, with your CARES funds, or with both. They would be reported in that first line. Then there was a second line to report on the subset of those households that received heating assistance with CARES funding. So that subset would be reported on the second line. For the Grantee Survey, the focus is on fiscal information, on the amount of funding from one source and how it was used. So the Grantee Survey is asking you to report information for regular LIHEAP funds. For example, for heating assistance, again, how much of your regular LIHEAP funds that were awarded to you as block grants or reallotment funds during FY20, how much of those dollars were obligated for heating assistance. Then there'll be another line separately in the Grantee Survey asking you how much of your CARES funds you received were obligated for heating assistance and cooling assistance and so forth. So you'll be reporting that information separately from your regular LIHEAP funds. There's no fields in the revised Grantee Survey where you'll report regular LIHEAP and CARES funds together. So they'll always be distinguished in separate lines. So this is an image of what the uses of funds, the top of the uses of funds section looks like in your Grantee Survey. It should hopefully be familiar from the past if you've worked on the form. There's 3 columns here. There's total funds. That's the first column. Then there's average benefit levels. And then there's a column for reporting the maximum dollar income value for a 4-person household based on your income criteria. So this looks the same, but if you look at that first line, heating assistance benefits, it now says non-supplemental funds. So that means non-CARES funds. So these lines will be marked in that way. So this is where you'd report your regular LIHEAP funding information. Now let's look at the CARES fields. So it's the same layout, it's the same format. The only difference is these lines are where you'd report information for CARES Act funds, how much of your CARES you obligated for heating assistance, what the average household benefit was for CARES, and what the annual income criteria maximum dollar amount was. So hopefully that's not surprising and not concerning to you that it's the same format. And the CARES information is all put together, and the regular LIHEAP funding is all grouped together rather than having heating regular, heating CARES, cooling regular, cooling CARES. They will be grouped by regular and grouped by CARES. Okay, so when you're preparing to report, you'll need to be able to distinguish between your regular funds and the CARES Act funds. That's something that Dear Colleague letter mentioned, that you'd have to report separately on the CARES Act funds. And so you're going to need to be able to identify how you obligated your CARES Act funds, and also to be able to identify the benefit levels for those CARES Act funds. So for funding, as I mentioned, you report separately for your regular funds and your CARES funds. For average benefits, you're going to need to report the average benefit based on just the regular funds, and then the average benefit based on the CARES funds. I'll show some examples of this. For income thresholds, if you use the same income thresholds for program components that you might have funded with your regular funds and with CARES, then you may have the same information here that in both your regular lines and in your CARES lines. But if you use your CARES funds and had a special eligibility criteria for that program component or for receiving a supplemental CARES benefit, then you'll report the maximum income using that criteria for CARES, and it'll be different from what you report for your regular funds. So we're going to go through some examples with the idea being that grantees are using their CARES funds in a lot of different ways. And so looking at some examples will hopefully be helpful where you can see one that may apply to you. So first, we're going to look at Grantee Z. Grantee Z chose in FY 2020 to carry over all their CARES funds. So you can see I wrote they received $1 million for LIHEAP CARES Act funds. They decided not to obligate any of those funds during 2020, and instead they're carrying it all over to federal fiscal year 2021. So the table here shows how they would report in the grantee survey, and it shows some of the key lines. These aren't in the exact order in the form, but it's meant to show you how they would report. So under sources of CARES funds, they received $1 million. So it lists $1 million as their CARES Act allotment. Now they chose not to obligate any of that $1 million. So none of it was obligated for any assistance types. None of it was used for administration or planning. So we have $0 for administration and planning. They've carried it all over. So on the second line from the bottom, unobligated CARES Act funds carried over to the next federal fiscal year, Grantee Z would put $1 million. And so when you add up all the items under uses of CARES funds, their total sum is $1 million, and that equals the amount they received. And that's a key goal with your reporting in the grantee survey, is that whatever total you have under sources equals the total you have under uses for CARES, and as well as for under regular assistance. Okay, now we're going to look at Grantee X, and Grantee X chose to obligate CARES funds. They also received $1 million in LIHEAP CARES Act funds. They decided to obligate all of it during federal fiscal year 2020, which means they carried over $0. They used their CARES Act funds to provide a supplemental $50 benefit to households that had received their regular heating assistance. And 95% of their CARES funds went to those supplemental benefits, and they used 5% for administering the CARES supplemental benefit. So just like the last example, the total in sources is $1 million. That's what they received from their CARES Act allotment. Under heating assistance, they used all of their CARES for a supplemental benefit, but they saved 5% of it for administration. So heating assistance would be 95% of $1 million. That's $950 that I'm reporting under heating assistance. And under administration and planning, they'd report that 5% they used, which is $50,000. They carried over $0, so zeros in unobligated CARES Act funds carried over to the next federal fiscal year. And the sum of those uses adds up to $1 million again. So uses equals sources. If you look in the column on the right, average benefit amount, they used their CARES to issue all the households that got their regular assistance a $50 supplemental benefit. So their average benefit for CARES heating assistance is $50, and they would enter $50 in that column. Okay, now let's look at another example. This is Grantee Y, and Grantee Y decided to obligate half of their CARES funds and to use that for a new crisis program. This new crisis program was to implement a COVID crisis program. The average benefit was $250 for households that received that new CARES crisis program. And 95% of their funds that they obligated for the program went to the program and issuing benefits, and 5% went to administrative costs. Just as with the prior examples, the total they got was $1 million. So under sources for their CARES Act allotment, we'll say $1 million. They used half of their funds they obligated, and the other half they have carried over to federal fiscal year 2021. So you can see $500,000 is on the second line up from the bottom for carryover. The remaining $500,000 they obligated during 2020, 95% of it was used for their COVID crisis program. So that's $475,000 on the other crisis line. And then they used 5% for administration, so that's $25,000. So total uses was $1 million when you add up 475, 25, and 500,000, and that equals the total allotment of $1 million. and the average benefit for their COVID crisis program was $250, so they put that in the average benefit column. So these are just some examples. We know that states are using CARES in different ways, and we know that you may be using it in a way that doesn't exactly fit these examples, or you may be using it for a bunch of different purposes. So we encourage you, if you have questions, to reach out to us. If you're not sure how your use of CARES would fit into reporting in this way, please just reach out to us, and we'll try to assist you as everybody's learning how to do this, and we want to be able to assist you. Okay, now we're going to go on to some reporting reminders based on some common issues we see with Grantee Survey reports.
So the first reporting reminder is that there needs to be consistency between sources and uses. And so I always use the checkbook example and realize this morning that that is going to be outdated soon. But the concept is that, it's the end of every month, you look at the money that came in and you look at the money that came out, and you try to match those things up. And so that's what this grantee survey is all about. It should reflect how all the funds you received in FY 2020, which is your sources of funds, were obligated or used, which is your uses of funds. If all of the funding received were obligated or carry over, then the totals in these two sections should match. The amount of funds that you received should match the amount of funds that you obligated or carried over. Funding from the separate sources is reported in separate lines. So as a result, subtotals for each funding source in Section 3 should match the subtotals for each funding source in Section 4. So for example, line 10 in Section 3, which is the subtotal of non-supplemental funds, should match line 14 in Section 4, the total uses of non-supplemental funds. Line 11 in Section 3, which is your CARES Act allotment, should match line 25 in Section 4, which is the total uses of your CARES Act funds. This report should also be consistent with your household report. So if you said that you served heating, let me use a different example. If you said you served winter crisis households in your household report, we would expect to see that your uses of funds reflect money obligated to winter crisis households. So you should be able to report for anything you included in your household report, the total funds that were obligated to that, the average household benefit, and the maximum annual dollar income. There are some rare exceptions, and for these you'll want to add a note. So if you obligated $0 for a type of assistance reported in your household report, you'll want to make sure to indicate that in your notes. So for example, you may have obligated money for winter crisis in the previous year but not spent it until 2020, but you didn't obligate anything to it in 2020. You're just spending prior year obligations. So that would be a situation where your grantee survey and your household report don't quite match up, and you should include a note. If you obligated funds for assistance, but you reported 0 assisted households for that assistance in your household report, that's another issue kind of in the same vein that you'll want to make sure you include a note for. So the third is average household benefits. So the grantee survey asks you for information on the average benefit amount for households assisted with each type of assistance. So for each type of assistance, that means heating, cooling, winter crisis, whatever lines that you're including in your household report that you're also including in your grantee survey, the average household benefit should take into account all types of benefits provided under that type of assistance during the entire fiscal year. This means that if you are one of those states that gives out multiple heating assistance benefits, or maybe you give out a heating assistance benefit and then a supplemental heating assistance benefit, you'll want to make sure that you are including that all when you calculate the average benefit for heating. The average benefit is calculated by summing the benefit amounts across all households that received the assistance and dividing by the total number of households that received the assistance. You'll want to separate, and Dan told me before the webinar started, everything in yellow means that this is something new. So you'll want to separately calculate the average benefit amount for regular LIHEAP, non-CARES, and CARES funds. If the average household benefit includes benefits other than bill payment assistance, please include a description of the benefit types in the notes section. There are a handful of states who do, for example, equipment repair and replacement as part of their regular heating program. And so if you are one of those states, or you give some kind of assistance that is not bill payment directly, that you probably can't quantify in an average benefit, then you'll want to include a description of the benefit types in the notes section. And the maximum annual dollar income. The Grantee Survey asks you for information on the maximum annual or dollar income cutoff for a 4-person household that was in effect at the beginning of FY 2020. And so just so you all know, the poverty guidelines that were in effect at the beginning of FY 2020 were the 2019 poverty guidelines. But if you have a program component that began after the release of the new poverty guidelines, you might choose to put those guidelines into your Grantee Survey report. So for example, some of you have used the 2019 poverty guidelines for your heating assistance season, which begins obviously earlier in the federal fiscal year. But by the time you started your cooling assistance programs, the new guidelines had come out, and so you switched to those. So you can opt to include those new guidelines under the cooling section in your Grantee Survey. If you do opt to use those, you'll want to include a note stating that in the notes section of your form. If you provided assistance using CARES funds, you'll want to report the amount based on the income criteria used to receive the CARES benefit. And now we're going to talk about data validation and checks.
Just like with the performance measures or with the household report, your Grantee Survey data that you submit in March will be reviewed. When we conduct the review, we do a few different steps. The first is that we review the Grantee Survey itself to make sure information is internally consistent. It's very easy to make a typo. It's very easy to put something in the wrong line. And so the purpose of checking the internal consistency is to find those kinds of issues and to alert you to them so that they can be confirmed as correct or corrected. So an example of this could be that you report a total amount of funds being obligated to cooling assistance, let's say $1 million, but you report no average benefit amounts for cooling assistance. That would be an example where we'd ask you if you did obligate funds to cooling, if you can report the average benefit, or explain why there's no average benefit. A second thing we check is that the report is consistent with the information you provide in your other reports. And Melissa talked about that earlier with the household report. That's also true for your model plan. Your model plan says, here's what we intended to do during this federal fiscal year. And if there's something that isn't consistent in the Grantee Survey, for example, your income, maximum income threshold is much higher than what the maximum income level should be based on the criteria in your model plan, we would also check for that and ask you about that. We also review the notes that you put in the Grantee Survey. At the end, there's a note section. And that note section is really important because it can help you to explain issues that maybe the Grantee Survey can't capture. There's not really a field to let you capture that nuance. So we look at those notes because they help us to understand your report, and those notes can be used in the final published information in the LIHEAP report to Congress to help explain your information accurately. And then a new step that we'll be doing to review your FY20 grantee surveys is looking at the CARES information to also verify that that is also internally consistent and consistent with what you've reported about CARES in other reports. For example, in your FY20 carryover report, you indicated the amount you carried over into FY 2021. So in your grantee survey, we expect to see the same information reported to show accuracy across those two reports. The review process is really to aid you in making sure your report is accurate prior to publicizing that information and placing it in the data warehouse and report to Congress. And once we've done that review and it is complete, we will alert you that your report is confirmed to be complete. Okay, now we're going to do some final reminders, and then we'll take some questions. Okay, so as I mentioned a few times in the webinar, there have been changes to the Grantee Survey, Module 1 of the Performance Data Form. It has been changed for this year as well as for next year's FY 2021 form. And the purpose of the changes is to be able to track and monitor the use of LIHEAP CARES funds. As in the past, you're required to report on your sources and uses of your regular LIHEAP funds, your block grant funds, your reallotment funds, funds you carried into fiscal year 2020. And the new lines have been added so you can report the same information on the sources and uses of your CARES funds. The overall format is going to be consistent with the past. The form will look the same except for the addition of the CARES lines. And just as a reminder, if you missed the recent webinars we did on Module 2, the performance measures, there have been no changes to Module 2. The reporting requirements and lines are the same as in the past. So this, the changes to the Grantee Survey, the new lines for CARES, there are not new lines for CARES in Module 2. OCS is expected to issue the action transmittal soon with the revised due date for the performance data form. The report will be due in March, so we strongly encourage you to be working on it and moving forward based on what you've done in the past and the information in this webinar and in our next webinar. The action transmittal will include the instructions document, but if you'd like to review any instructions, you can access right now the 2019 instructions. And we also have a check before you submit document that we have worked on for the Grantee Survey, and there's a link to it in this webinar. And that has some helpful suggestions for how you can check the information that your fiscal staff has prepared or that you've entered into the report before you submit it. As I mentioned, there is going to be a change with the submission approach for your FY20 performance data form. OCS will be sending each grantee an Excel spreadsheet of the 2020 performance data form, and that spreadsheet will include your pre-populated sources of funds information. They're asking that you enter your grantee survey data and your performance measures data into your spreadsheet and that you submit that in March. They'll be sending further instructions about that soon. But our hope is that the spreadsheet process will be easy and we'll be able to assist you with any issues that may occur. At a later date, once your form has been finalized, we will be asking you to copy your approved final report from the spreadsheet into OLDC. So this slide has that check before you submit document I mentioned earlier. It also has a link to the 2019 instructions. If you want to look at your grantee survey from the past, maybe you get asked a question from management or someone in your state, and you want to look at maybe how your average benefit levels have changed over the last 10 or 20 years, how your obligation of funds has changed across your assistance types. You can get that very quickly in the LIHEAP data warehouse. And if you need any assistance, just reach out to us and we'll help point you to how to use that tool. So this is the first of 2 webinars on Module 1. This one is the shorter webinar. So the next webinar is going to be 90 minutes, and we will have more examples related to the new CARES fields, and we'll dive more into each line of the report. So if you're feeling like some questions didn't get totally answered, or you're newer to the Grantee Survey, this second webinar will be useful for you. You'll be getting the invitation for that today to register for that webinar. We have support resources for you. For OCS, if you're looking to contact your federal liaison, you can get it from the link on the top of this page. If you're experiencing issues with OLDC for other reports or any kind of challenges, there's the help desk link. And then you can contact us at a prize. And we really encourage you, with 2020 being an unusual year and a year with a lot of changes, that you reach out if you have a question or you're not sure exactly how to report something that's changed with your program. Reach out to us and we'll help. Okay, so we have some time for questions. So if you have a question and you haven't submitted it yet, you can type it in, and Jorge receives all the questions and then starts to go through them. So Jorge, do we have any questions?
Yes, Dan, we have a couple of questions. So the first one is, I understand that the fiscal year 2020 CARES can be carried over into fiscal year 2021. But will we be able to carry over the fiscal year 2021 CARES funds into fiscal year 2022?
No. All the CARES funds have to be obligated by the end of fiscal year 2021. So you'll need, if you've carried them all over to this fiscal year 2021, you need to have them obligated by the end of this federal fiscal year. Now, if you have questions or you're concerned about how your ability to be able to do that, I encourage you to reach out to your liaison, and they can help get in touch with the OCS fiscal staff to help advise you on that.
Okay, we have another question. So someone said, we obligated our CARES money in 2020, but didn't use it for benefits until 2021. Where do we report that?
So as we talked about earlier, that the Grantee Survey is focused on obligations, and that's a really important concept because it's not always the same as expenditures. So obligations, again, would be that you have in your state determined that those funds have been obligated for a specific purpose. It doesn't always mean that those funds were actually delivered to households in the form of benefits yet, because it may be a process to get to that point. So for your Grantee Survey, if that's the case for you, for your CARES funds, you'd want to report the funds under the assistance category where you obligated them and intend to provide benefits using those CARES funds. So this is similar, even if you had not received the CARES funds during FY20, this is similar to what many states have to do with their regular funds, which is they obligate them, and then they may not come out in the form of benefits and be expended until later. You'd still report them under the assistance category that best describes how they were obligated. Melissa, is there anything you want to add there?
Yeah, so the only thing I would add is that where it says average household benefit, obviously you didn't give benefits. So for this year, it would be 0. And then for next year, you're going to show that you didn't obligate any new funds for CARES, but you did have an average benefit. So that average benefit is going to be 0, and the obligated funds is going to be whatever you obligated out. Is that correct, Dan?
Yeah.
There's another question. If funds are returned by utility companies for energy assistance benefits after the grantee survey is completed and finalized, is a revision needed to de-obligate these funds?
So we talked about this a little bit on the carryover report webinar, I believe, which was in December. You're not expected to continually update the grantee survey if you're receiving refunds, small amounts of refunds over an extended period of time. What you are expected to do is, at the time of your grantee survey, to use your information system and your fiscal system to put the amount you have based on your current information about the amount that was not obligated and that you have carried over, and then to make sure that that amount is consistent with what's in your carryover report for FY20. If you have more specific questions, or if there's a large change that occurs, we encourage you to reach out to us and your liaison so we can help advise you.
There's another question. Are income criteria changes during fiscal year 2020 based on the virus? I think you said to report based on the criteria used at the beginning of the fiscal year. Is this correct?
For your income criteria, in general, for the grantee survey, there is the column that we showed you earlier for reporting the maximum income amount for a 4-person household. And in general, you would report the maximum amount you had in place at the start of the program year for that type of assistance. 2020 was an unusual year, so we know it may be complicated because you may have changed your income criteria based on the coronavirus and based on the CARES funds. We recommend that you include any notes about that so that it's clear what you chose to report and why. And if you're not sure about what criteria to use, you can reach out to us as well, and we can try to help sort through it with you.
Thanks. And we have one more question. Can you explain how will the CARES items be checked?
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question. So remember what was on one of the earlier slides and what Melissa talked about, which is that the grantee surveys the intention is to have a picture of how each grantee is using their federal LIHEAP funds, the types of assistance you're providing, the average benefit amounts. It's not intended as an audit report, but it's intended to get that snapshot picture to be able to report on what LIHEAP funds are being used for nationally and by state. So for the CARES items, it's the same purpose is intended in having you report that information. When we check it, we'll be checking that the CARES information, as I mentioned earlier, is internally consistent. So if you received $2 million in CARES funds, all of the lines under uses of CARES funds should add up to $2 million so that we know where all those dollars were going to. We'll also be checking it for consistency with what we know about how you used your CARES funds from your other reports. For your household report, you recently had to report information on how many households received assistance that was paid for in full or in part by the CARES funds. So if we see that you've reported on your household report that you used CARES to provide households with cooling assistance and with year-round crisis assistance, we'd expect to see funds obligated to cooling and year-round crisis in the Grantee Survey, and not to see funds obligated to other assistance types that weren't in the household report. So those are the main ways we check it. Again, the goal is just to be able to assist you with making sure the reporting is correct, and it's nothing where we check in any further ways that are more auditory. Anything else, Melissa, you want to say about that?
Nope, you covered it.
Any last minute questions, Jorge, before we finish the webinar?
No, I'm not getting any additional questions.
All right. Well, before you all hop off, if you can, we'd like to ask you a poll question so we know how helpful this webinar was and how we can prepare for the next webinar. So, Jorge, can you run the poll? Again, these are anonymous, so we don't know how a particular person answers. So if you could just answer, how confident are you that you understand how to correctly complete the FY 2020 Grantee Survey? We really appreciate your time today. OCS is working hard on the action transmittal. If you're facing any big challenges, again, reach out to us and we'll try to assist you. And we will be sending out registration for the next webinar shortly. Okay, we're going to wrap up the poll here in a couple seconds. Okay. All right, so we'll be working based on these to prepare for the next webinar. Thank you again for your time. The slides are available in the handouts. If you haven't downloaded them already, you can click under handouts, the little red triangle, or red rectangle, and download them. And we look forward to speaking with you at the next webinar. Thank you very much for your time.